Boston, 1978. A Back Bay apartment with a baby grand Steinway in the corner, bought and paid for by a woman who is, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, living entirely alone. She is 41 years old. She trained for years as a classical pianist, the kind of training that eats up your childhood and teaches your hands things they never forget. She once thought that training might lead somewhere, a concert stage, an audience that came to hear her, not her husband. Instead, her life got rerouted into somebody else's career. She has been in Alcoholics Anonymous a little over a year. She has just enrolled in graduate school, and she has just told a reporter from People magazine something most women in her position, in 1978, would never say for the record, that she had to suffer, that she had caused her own family real trouble, before she could finally face what was wrong with her life. Her name is Joan Bennett Kennedy. Her husband is Senator Edward Kennedy, brother of a murdered president and a murdered attorney general, one of the most powerful men in the country. For 20 years she was the Kennedy wife. She stood next to him at podiums, at funerals, at a car accident inquest that made headlines on 3 continents, while her own name and her own gifts got smaller in the background of somebody else's story. She died in her sleep on October 8, 2025, at 89 years old. By then she had spent almost as many years rebuilding an identity as she had spent losing one. This is the story of how that erasure happened, one campaign and one tragedy at a time. It's also the story of what she built once nobody was watching anymore. If quiet unravelings behind famous marriages are the kind of thing you come here for, subscribe now. We do one of these a week. This is one of the harder ones. Chapter 1. The girl who was supposed to play piano, not politics. Virginia Joan Bennett was born September 2, 1936, in Manhattan, into a family that looked, from the outside, like classic old money. Her father, Harry Bennett, was a Cornell man who ran a New York advertising agency. Her mother, also named Virginia, kept the household. Both parents drank, and both struggled with it in the particular way wealthy families of that era struggled. Quietly, at home, never discussed at the dinner table, never named out loud. Joan grew up watching that pattern happen around her before she understood it was a pattern at all. She had a younger sister, Candace, and the 2 of them were raised in Bronxville, comfortable, Catholic, expected to marry well and stay out of the newspapers. She left for Manhattanville College in Purchase, New York, a Catholic women's school that happened to be the alma mater of a whole cluster of Kennedy women. Rose Kennedy went there, so did Jean and Eunice and Ethel. Joan didn't choose it for that reason. She chose it by her own later accounts, partly for the education, and partly to put distance between herself and her parents' house, close enough to check in, far enough to build something of her own. At Manhattanville, she became friends with a classmate named Jean Kennedy. That friendship is the reason this entire story exists, because in October of 1957, at a ceremony dedicating a campus gymnasium in memory of Jean's late sister Kathleen, Jean introduced Joan to her younger brother. He was a law student at the University of Virginia, tall, restless, still finding his footing in a family that already had a president-in-waiting and a future attorney general in it. Everyone called him Ted. Joan was already something in her own right before any of that. As a teenager, she modeled for television advertisements. She trained seriously as a classical pianist, hours a day, the kind of discipline that produces real technical skill rather than a party trick. Ask anyone who studies music what that kind of training does to a person's sense of themselves, and they'll tell you it becomes part of your identity, not just a hobby you keep in a drawer. If her life had bent a few degrees differently, there's a real version of Joan Bennett who ends up on a concert stage instead of a receiving line. She was, by her own account, immediately taken with Ted. He was tall and he was gorgeous, she said later, and it isn't hard to believe her. What she couldn't have known, standing at 21 next to a law student with a famous last name, was how much of herself that last name was eventually going to cost. The courtship moved fast enough that Joan later admitted she got nervous, that she barely knew the man she'd agreed to marry. Joseph Kennedy Sr., the family patriarch, was not the type of man who let nerves stand in the way of a wedding once it had been decided. The couple married on November 29, 1958, at St. Joseph's Church in Bronxville. She was 22. Ted was still finishing law school, so the honeymoon waited until after he passed the bar the following year. Standing at that altar, Joan had no way of knowing she wasn't just marrying a man. She was marrying an entire political apparatus, one that would consume most of the next 25 years of her life, sometimes gently, and sometimes not gently at all. It's worth pausing on who she was in the years right before that wedding, because so much of what came later gets read backward through the marriage, as though nothing before it counted. She wasn't a debutante killing time until a good match came along. She was a working student who majored in music and English, someone who spent afternoons in practice rooms instead of on the tennis court, someone whose modeling work as a teenager had come with its own small taste of a career that belonged entirely to her. Friends from Manhattanville remembered her as serious about her studies in a way that surprised people who expected a Bronxville girl to coast. She graduated in 1958, the same year she married, finishing her degree only months before her entire identity started getting filed under somebody else's last name. Her parents' marriage had shown her one version of what a life like that could cost a person. Her mother had spent decades managing a household and a husband's drinking, without much of an identity outside of it, and Joan later admitted she recognized the shape of that arrangement almost immediately once she was living inside her own version of it. She didn't leave for Manhattanville only to escape her parents. She left, in part, hoping to avoid becoming her mother. It's one of the quieter ironies of her life that the marriage she walked into ended up testing that same fear in ways she couldn't have predicted at 22. Chapter 2. Camelot, from the outside looking in. The timeline moves fast from here, almost too fast to process in real time, which is part of why Joan spent so many years processing it after the fact instead. In 1960, Ted's older brother John was elected president. Joan, 24 years old with a new baby daughter named Cara, found herself photographed at inaugural balls next to people who ran the free world. 3 years later, she watched that same brother-in-law get assassinated in Dallas, live, on television, like everyone else in the country. There was no private version of that grief available to her. It happened in public, and it kept happening in public. In 1961, she gave birth to a son, Edward Jr. In 1964, a pregnancy ended in a stillbirth, a loss that rarely makes it into the official Kennedy family timelines, but which she carried the way anyone carries that kind of loss. That same year, Ted's older brother Robert was elected to the Senate from New York. 4 years after that, in June of 1968, Joan watched him get assassinated too, shot in a hotel kitchen in Los Angeles while running for president himself. 2 brothers-in-law murdered within 5 years of each other. That's the backdrop Joan Kennedy's entire married life sat against, and it's easy to forget that when you're only looking at the glamorous photographs of the family at a regatta or a debutante ball. In 1967, she had another son, Patrick, who would grow up to matter to this story more than almost anyone realized at the time. Ted's own political career accelerated through all of it, seemingly unbothered by the chaos around it, or maybe fueled by it. He won election to the U.S. Senate from Massachusetts in 1962 at just 30 years old, becoming almost overnight one of the most talked-about legislators in the country, despite plenty of early skepticism that he was simply riding the family name into office. Joan campaigned at his side through every mile of it, doing the job political wives were expected to do in that era, smiling on command, greeting strangers by the hundreds, standing exactly where the photographers needed her to stand and nowhere else. She was good at parts of it, genuinely. She had real warmth with people, and the piano training had given her an ease performing in front of a room that most political spouses had to fake. But performing for a concert audience and performing for a campaign crowd used different muscles entirely. One of those muscles was slowly taking up all the room the other one used to occupy, and she wouldn't fully notice the trade until much later. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from performing warmth on a schedule you didn't set. Joan gave interviews during these years describing days that started before dawn with hair and makeup, moved through 3 or 4 separate campaign stops in different towns, and ended with a late dinner where she was expected to remember the names of donors' spouses and the ages of their children. She was good at it. People who worked those campaigns remembered her as unfailingly kind to volunteers, the kind of candidate's wife who thanked the person handing out flyers on a street corner in February instead of walking past them. But kindness under those conditions runs on a finite tank, and nobody around her was checking the gauge. There was also the matter of what campaigning did to her music. She kept playing when she could, squeezing practice into hotel rooms and the rare free afternoon, but a concert pianist's technique erodes without daily discipline, and daily discipline was the one thing a national political calendar does not permit. Every year she spent introducing her husband at rallies was a year she wasn't spending in front of a keyboard building toward anything of her own. She noticed the erosion. She talked about it later as one of the quieter griefs of that period, smaller than an assassination and easier to explain away, and for that reason almost harder to mourn out loud. If the parts of a famous marriage that never make it into the campaign brochure are what you're here for, subscribe and turn on notifications. We're doing another one of these next week. Tell us in the comments which political wife story you want us to dig into next. Chapter 3. Chappaquiddick. On the night of July 18, 1969, Ted Kennedy attended a party on Chappaquiddick Island, off Martha's Vineyard, for a group of women who had worked on Robert Kennedy's presidential campaign the year before. Sometime around midnight, he drove his car off a narrow bridge and into a tidal channel. He escaped the submerged vehicle. His passenger, 28-year-old Mary Jo Kopechny, did not. Kennedy waited 10 hours before reporting the accident to police. Joan was home at the time, confined to bed rest, pregnant with their fourth child after 2 previous miscarriages. She learned what had happened the way most of America eventually did, through the news. And then she did something that tells you almost everything you need to know about what this marriage expected of her. She got out of bed. She attended Mary Jo Kopechny's funeral. 3 days later, she stood beside her husband at the courthouse for his hearing, visibly pregnant, in front of a wall of photographers documenting the worst week of her family's life. 6 days before the inquest into Kopechny's death began that September, Joan miscarried, her third. She later said she blamed the loss on the strain of that summer and everything that came with it. Her husband was on a camping trip with their 2 older children when it happened. He rushed to the hospital once someone reached him. Ted Kennedy pleaded guilty to leaving the scene of an accident causing personal injury and received a 2-month suspended sentence. Massachusetts voters re-elected him to the Senate the following year anyway. Chappaquiddick almost certainly cost him any real shot at the presidency in 1972 or 1976, and it followed him for the rest of his career, a shadow that never fully lifted no matter how many decades of legislative work he piled on top of it. What it cost Joan doesn't show up in most retellings of that story at all. A dead child she never got to have. A body put back to work in front of cameras 6 days before that loss, because the family needed the optics of a loyal, composed wife standing beside a senator in trouble. She gave a wire service reporter one line that week that made the papers, "I believe everything Ted said." Whether she actually did or not is a question nobody at the time particularly bothered to ask her directly. Chapter 4. A son's cancer and a drinking problem that stopped being private. 4 years later, in November of 1973, the Kennedys got another piece of devastating news. Their 12-year-old son, Ted Jr., was diagnosed with bone cancer in his right leg. Doctors amputated above the knee to save his life. Joan spent long stretches at Georgetown University Hospital with him through the surgery and the chemotherapy that followed. One more crisis absorbed into a marriage that had already absorbed an assassination, a second assassination, a national scandal, and a miscarriage. By her own later admission, this was roughly the point where her drinking, which had probably been building for years inside a family culture where alcohol was simply how people coped, stopped being something she could manage quietly. In 1974, she was arrested for driving under the influence. It was the first time her private struggle became a public headline instead of a private rumor whispered at parties. It would not be the last. She was arrested for the same thing twice more by 1991, and her name started attaching itself to a single word in newspaper copy: alcoholic. She talked, later, in an interview remarkable for its honesty given the era, about how much she hated being reduced to that word by strangers who had never met her. Walk into a room, and people stopped seeing a trained pianist, a mother of 3, a woman who had buried 2 brothers-in-law and lost 3 pregnancies. They saw the headline. For a stretch of the 1970s, the headline wasn't entirely wrong either, which made it harder to argue with and harder to live inside of. A claim surfaced years later, reported after her death, that Ted actively discouraged her from attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings during this period, worried about what a public admission of her struggle might do to his political standing. Whether that specific account holds up in every detail or not, it fits a pattern that runs through the whole marriage. Joan's crises got managed for their effect on Ted's career, rather than treated as her own emergencies to solve on her own terms. Doctors at the time were also working with far less understanding of alcoholism as a disease than they have now. Joan later described being handed tranquilizers and sedatives by well-meaning physicians who had no real framework for treating dependency, medications that in hindsight probably made things worse rather than better. She spent stretches of the mid-1970s cycling through private clinics, some of them more concerned with discretion than treatment, environments built to protect a family name rather than to fix the person inside it. It would take her years to find her way to a program that actually worked for her, and by her own account, the version of AA she eventually committed to in Boston looked nothing like the quiet, sanitized interventions the family had arranged around her in Washington. It looked like church basements and folding chairs, and strangers who had no idea who Ted Kennedy was. Chapter 5. The apartment in Boston. By 1977, Joan had moved out. Ted stayed in the family's home outside Washington. Joan took an apartment on Beacon Street in Boston, alone for the first time in nearly 2 decades, and started building a life around things that had nothing to do with anyone else's campaign schedule. She began seeing a psychiatrist. She started attending AA meetings regularly, on her own terms this time. She enrolled in a graduate program in education at Lesley College in Cambridge, work that would eventually earn her a master's degree in 1982. That Steinway from the cold open sat in that apartment. She played it, by her own account, purely for herself, for the first time in years without an audience to manage or a role to perform for anyone else. It's tempting to read that Boston apartment as the end of the story. It wasn't. In 1980, Ted decided to challenge the sitting president, Jimmy Carter, for the Democratic nomination, and Joan came back one more time to campaign at his side. She gave interviews arguing, with a defensiveness that reads differently now than it must have read then, that she'd make a better First Lady than Carter's wife Rosalind, pointing to her own meetings with world leaders like Leonid Brezhnev as evidence she had more to offer than people assumed of her. Looking back, it reads like a woman trying to reclaim some measure of authority inside a role that had spent 2 decades shrinking her, using the only stage she'd ever really been handed. The campaign failed. Ted lost the nomination to Carter that summer. Whatever reunion the campaign trail had briefly manufactured between Joan and Ted turned out to be exactly as temporary as it looked from the outside, and probably always was. There's a photograph from that primary season that circulated widely at the time. Joan and Ted on a stage together, hands raised, both smiling for a crowd that had no idea the marriage behind the smile had already effectively ended. Reporters who covered the campaign closely noted how separately the two of them traveled once the cameras stopped rolling. Different cars, different hotels, a coordination that looked seamless in public and non-existent in private. Joan later said she agreed to campaign that year, partly out of loyalty to the family, and partly because she believed, even then, that it might be the last time anyone asked her opinion on anything that mattered to the country. She wanted to use the platform while she still had it, even knowing the marriage attached to that platform was already over in every way that counted. Chapter 6. Divorce, and a life she built on purpose. The Kennedys separated for good not long after the failed 1980 campaign. Their divorce was finalized in 1982, after 24 years of marriage, on the legal grounds of what the paperwork called an irretrievable breakdown. Joan received a settlement, alimony, and half of the couple's property. Ted went on to marry attorney Victoria Reggie a decade later, a marriage that by most accounts gave him a stability the first one never fully had. Joan spent the next 4 decades building something that had almost gotten lost entirely inside the marriage, a life defined by her own name instead of somebody else's. In 1992, she published a book, The Joy of Classical Music, a guide for you and your family, aimed at bringing the kind of music education she'd grown up with to people who'd never had access to it. She narrated classical works with orchestras, including engagements connected to the Boston Pops, standing on the kind of stage her younger self had once imagined standing on, decades later than planned but not too late to matter. She taught piano lessons herself and worked with Boston public schools through partnerships tied to Leslie, putting instruments and instruction in front of kids who otherwise wouldn't have had either. She became one of the earliest public figures, male or female, willing to speak candidly about alcoholism and depression, at a moment when celebrity confessionals about either subject were rare and genuinely risky to a person's reputation. She talked openly about using music to get through the worst stretches of her life: the deaths of her brothers-in-law, her son's cancer diagnosis, her divorce, all of it. In one later interview, she said flatly that music had given her the courage to keep going. The second half of her life wasn't a straight line upward, and it's worth resisting the urge to tell it that way. Her drinking returned in force in the early 2000s. She relapsed, was hospitalized more than once, and in 2005 underwent treatment for breast cancer, on top of everything else her body was carrying by then. Years of heavy drinking had damaged her kidneys badly enough that she eventually required dialysis. At one especially low point, she was found passed out in the street and broke her shoulder in the fall. Her 3 adult children, watching their mother's health and judgment deteriorate in ways that alarmed them, went to court in 2006 to have a legal guardian appointed to manage her affairs and ensure she received treatment. It was not a punitive move. It was the kind of intervention families make when they've run out of other options. And it worked, in the sense that it kept her alive and stabilized long enough for her to recover a measure of the life she'd been rebuilding since Beacon Street. In 2009, Ted Kennedy died of brain cancer. Joan attended the funeral, one more public appearance in a marriage that had generated so many of them, this time as a former wife rather than a standing one, closing a chapter that had opened with a gymnasium dedication more than 50 years earlier. People who saw her that week described someone composed, dignified, present for her children rather than for the cameras, a very different woman than the one who had stood pregnant outside a courthouse in 1969, with no real choice in the matter. This time she had a choice, and she chose to be there anyway, for Cara and Ted Jr. and Patrick, if not for the man himself. Her guardianship, put in place 3 years earlier, remained active for the rest of her life, a fact that some later coverage treated as a footnote and others treated as the whole story, when really it was neither. It meant that decisions about her finances and her medical care ran through her children rather than through her alone, an arrangement born out of genuine crisis rather than any effort to control her. Those who knew her in this period describe a woman who chafed at the loss of independence at times, and, at other times, seemed relieved that someone else was finally carrying the weight of managing her own survival, after decades spent managing everyone else's. Her son Patrick, who went on to become a US congressman from Rhode Island and one of the country's leading advocates for addiction and mental health policy, has said directly that watching his mother face her struggles with honesty shaped the entire direction of his own career. That's not a small legacy. It's arguably a larger one than anything the marriage itself produced. A straight line from a woman's private shame to a piece of federal policy fighting for parity in how mental illness and addiction get treated by insurance companies and by the country at large. Her daughter Cara built a quieter life around philanthropy and film production, staying largely out of the political spotlight her parents had lived under for so long, which by several accounts was very much a deliberate choice rather than an accident of circumstance. Ted Jr. became a lawyer and later a state senator in Connecticut, carrying the family's political instincts forward in his own smaller arena, and he spoke often over the years about how his mother's presence at his hospital bedside during his cancer treatment shaped his own advocacy for people with disabilities. All 3 of Joan's children, in different registers, ended up building careers around some version of the crises that had defined their childhood. That's not a coincidence. It's what happens when a family survives that much in public and then has to decide, individually, what to do with it afterward. Chapter 7. What the marriage actually cost her. It's worth sitting with the shape of it plainly, without softening the edges. Joan Kennedy married into a family at 22, with real musical talent and a life of her own still forming. Over the following 24 years, that marriage ran her through 2 presidential assassinations in the family, a scandal that put her, visibly pregnant, in front of a wall of cameras 6 days before a miscarriage, a son's cancer diagnosis and amputation, and a drinking problem that the people closest to her often seemed more interested in managing for its public relations effect than actually helping her fix. None of that happened because Ted Kennedy set out to destroy his wife's career. Most of it happened the way these things usually do, through decades of a family's crises being treated as public property and a wife's identity being treated as an accessory to her husband's. Joan wasn't unique in that. Plenty of political wives of her generation lived some version of the same arrangement, smiling in the same receiving lines, absorbing the same expectation that their own ambitions would simply wait their turn indefinitely. What made her story different is that she eventually said so, on the record, decades before it was safe or fashionable to do it. She spent the second half of her life proving that the woman underneath the Kennedy wife had been there the entire time, waiting for room to exist. She got that room, eventually, on Beacon Street, in a graduate classroom at Lesley. In front of an orchestra she got to narrate instead of merely attend. Joan Bennett Kennedy died in her sleep at her home in Boston on October 8, 2025, at 89 years old. She had spent her final years largely out of the public eye, which, given how much of her younger life had been spent performing for cameras she never asked for, might have been exactly the ending she wanted for herself. Not applause, just quiet, on her own terms, in a city she'd chosen for herself, back when choosing anything for herself still felt like a radical act. If this story hit the way it hit us while researching it, subscribe and turn on notifications, because we've got another one of these hidden political marriages coming next week. And if you want to go deeper on Joan Kennedy's own words, her 1978 People magazine interview is still one of the most candid things a Kennedy has ever said on the record. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.